Hello, it is my pleasure to welcome you to another episode of It's Not That Simple. Fantastic conversation heading your way. Another one, I'm absolutely sure about that. Our topic for this episode is vetting. What it is, how it works. We're going to break the whole topic down, also explained examples where specifically it has functioned, when it hasn't functioned, and why. Obviously, I'm not going to be doing this myself. We're going to get the help of our star guest, Alyssa Mastromonaco. Who is she? Well, if you don't know, I'll tell you. She made history in 2011 by becoming the youngest woman ever to be Deputy Chief of Staff at the White House with President Barack Obama. She is now an author, spokeswoman, executive producer, podcaster, influencer, but in the old sense of the definition of the word before social media. Alyssa, I think that is enough of an introduction for you, even though you have many accomplishments in your career. It's fantastic to have you on the Foundation Show to talk about this topic, and taking into account that it is quite, how shall I put it, not new, but at least not as common as it is in the States when we talk about vetting here in Europe, here in Portugal. Let's start with a simple definition, in your words.
Of vetting?
Yes.
I would say, to me, that vetting is the methodical review of past relationships in every sense of the word. Financial relationships, political relationships, familial relationships, any relationship that you have had going back however many years as people deem necessary for the post. It is a review of that. And as it relates to, are you trustworthy? Do you have good judgment? And are you reliable? That's how I would define vetting.
Okay, I think that's a very objective way to do it, because it is quite a complicated process. So tell me exactly how it works. And I know you have personal experience of this as well. So when someone is vetted, what goes on?
So I will be specific about the US government and
Okay.
public service vetting. So vetting in America goes back to the 1800s. When elected officials decided that there needed to be a little bit more rigor around who was going to represent the American people, right? And the most important thing is that the people can trust you. They're electing you to make decisions on their behalf. Mm-hmm. How can they trust you? And so vetting is the sort of deconstruction of who you are. Going back to, here in the US, my first real vetting went back to include a controversy over a dorm room from my college years, because the dorm room had been taken down. It had been destroyed because they put a new building up. And so the vetting here, it to be in the administration, in the president's administration, in the federal government, is so nuanced that I had to provide documentation that the building had been taken down. And ultimately, everything along the way that you are answering, it all goes to, are you trustworthy? And one of the things, when I was White House Deputy Chief of Staff, I oversaw the vetting of cabinet secretaries and sub-cabinet. Ambassadors, you name it. And, people will always forget things, and that is fine. But it is whether or not, when being asked personal questions about their college papers that they may have written, it is things that are discoverable. If you lie about them, it is disqualifying. And I think that in the US, that is probably the through line to all vetting, that if you do not tell the truth, mm-hmm. if you say something and then are questioned about it and it is found to be untrue, it is disqualifying. Because what happens then if you've lied? If you are lying, why are you lying? And if you are lying, who knows that someone knows that you're lying, which means that you are subject to, or susceptible rather, to blackmail,
right,
to foreign influence. And that is what they're trying to weed out when you come into the federal government. For example, and the thing is, over the years, some of these standards have come into question because some of them may be classist, right? Having a certain amount of debt. Someone who worked for me had, $50,000 in debt, and they worried that she would be susceptible to bribery, Now, the truth is that was all college debt, but debt is debt. And so where are exceptions made is also part of the vetting. You know, that may be the one first red flag they see, but when they go back into it, they'll say, okay, well, it was all college debt and she's paid everything on time. But there's sort of no level of nuance when you're going to work into the federal government. And that means Supreme Court justice, cabinet secretary, someone who's a staff person, almost anybody, especially if you want a national security clearance. There is sort of nothing that is off limits. And for me personally, I am someone who, growing up, I listened to the Grateful Dead. I loved to smoke pot. It was how I dealt with my anxiety. And in many administrations, including the current one, the Biden administration, that may be disqualifying. It wasn't disqualifying for me because I told the truth. I said, yep, I smoked marijuana. This is how much I smoked. This is where I got it. And then here in America, they will find your friends to corroborate both the good and bad of what you have told, to the point that you actually have to call your friends and say, they're going to ask you the FBI and the CIA are going to ask you if I did drugs. Tell the truth. Don't do me any favors and try to lie. Just tell the truth. And so the whole point of that is that once you have gotten into public service, once you have a job like mine, you cannot be embarrassed. If some reporter comes up or some blogger says, oh, did you know that she did, that she smoked pot, as a very loose example of something? Yes, we did. And here's how it's been handled, and none of your business. And it becomes a non-story. So much of vetting is preventing both bad actors from getting in the government and then preventing any sort of embarrassing stories for the government.
Okay, I'll be honest. What I'm thinking right now, and maybe what some people watching this conversation are thinking, is wait, because the United States had a president with all kinds of shady behavior in the past. So was he vetted, and how was he approved?
Well, this is something that we are. So now what you're talking about is actually like a campaign vetting, right? And the other thing that we have here in America are very long campaign seasons, where effectively a candidate is out talking to the American people, talking to reporters for almost, in some cases more than a year, but usually at least a year. And you would think that would solve the problem, and that people would be vetted. In the past, that is largely what the purpose of elections was. The problem is that now the people in the vetting, right? Who's doing the vetting in this case? It's reporters, but it's really the American people. And it's information coming out and them deciding, what do I care about? And something that is deeply troubling in this country right now is that everybody knew everything they needed to know about Donald Trump before he was ever elected. They knew that he said very objectionable and disgusting things about women. They knew about Stormy Daniels. His arraignment is happening blocks from my apartment here in New York today. This was all known. It was all known well before Election Day. And a lot of Americans decided they didn't care. And that's troubling. And I also think that if you even take Donald Trump aside, right, and you look at someone like George Santos, U.S. Congressman from New York, I think in this day and age, we have gotten away from understanding that social media, while social media can be a nightmare for people, things that you've posted can come back to haunt you. I also think that the media and the American people believe that, well, he has social media. There's social media. If anyone had said anything terrible, we'd know by now. They're almost leaving the vetting to social media, which is hugely problematic, because then you end up with a congressman who, shame on the Democratic Party, shame on the Republican Party, was never truly vetted. And now we have someone sitting in the House of Representatives. We don't know who he is. He apparently has so many different identities. He has had so many failed businesses. He is literally the walking example of everything vetting should catch. And there he sits in Congress. And so I would say for years and years, the process has been pretty successful here in the US. But ever since 2016, I think that we have a long way to go, and we have to find better ways to communicate to the American people in more nonpartisan ways. I think that when you go back here, the beginning of the 24/7 news cycle, you would think that that would add to the vetting of people. But in some ways, it distances people from the process, because they're like, oh, I hear this all the time, I don't want to hear anymore. Whereas if you go back, pre-2004, when most people got their news from the local news and the 6 o'clock nightly news, I think it seemed less partisan and less polarized, and people
for sure
listened a little bit more closely to any sort of red flags that a Tom Brokaw or Walter Cronkite or Barbara Walters might have raised about somebody.
Yeah, people certainly paid more attention to facts than opinions back then. I think
exactly.
And that's what gets kind of mixed up all the time these days, I think, is what's real, what's not, what's fact, what's an opinion. But I would think that for many politicians around the world, being vetted could be a little bit of a nightmare, right? Because the process by which you come to a position of power has to do with influence, has to do with relationships, and a lot of that would be examined in this process, and I guess eliminate them before they even had a chance to run for a particular office. Here in Portugal, recently, we had a series of ministers, of governors, and leaders who were appointed by government and then had to resign because certain facts about their past, certain relationships, certain conflicts of interest were exposed. What advice do you have when you see examples, not only in the States, but around the world of best practice and examples of what not to do as well? What words of wisdom do you normally look upon to share, taking into account your experience?
Well, what's interesting, and I did not have deep knowledge in this, but I was so interested, I did quite a bit of research. And it seems as though around the world, in most countries, there is at least some level of vetting as it relates to national security positions, right? Defense ministers, foreign ministers, ambassadors to the United Nations. Those folks in most countries seem to be vetted. But I think that where everyone falls a little bit short is that any person who has direct access to the prime minister, to the president, to the chancellor, you name it, they can influence them. And you need to know deeply what is influencing them. And I think that to not do, look at the trouble a crooked commerce minister or interior minister, as we say in the US, that person helps approve permits for oil drilling. Well, what if they have stock in an oil company? These are all things that are not, may not seem catastrophic, but they can erode the public trust. And so if you have someone, one of the greatest examples, I think, here in America of where vetting worked and where it could have been catastrophic had it not, was during the 2008 financial crisis. Our Treasury Secretary under the Bush administration was Hank Paulson. Hank Paulson had previously been the CEO of Goldman Sachs. Goldman Sachs, one of the banks that was in trouble. Imagine if he had to make the decision about whether to bail out Goldman Sachs as the former CEO. Why this wasn't a problem is that he was forced to sell all of his Goldman Sachs stock and shares prior to taking the post, as were all of the people who came to work for him from Goldman Sachs. And so whether it's a Treasury Secretary, an interior, and the thing is, the reason that the vetting, to me and around the world, I think people should just look a little bit deeper, is that you want the public trust, and you don't want to think that someone is making decisions, which unfortunately, and I don't say this as a political matter, I say it as a matter of fact, was an issue during the Trump administration, because you want people who have issue area expertise, but not people who are going to exploit their position. And so you need that vetting to understand what financial vested interests they have, whether it is, one of our commerce secretaries was Penny Pritzker. Penny Pritzker is the heiress, and she ran Hyatt worldwide. Well, a lot of things had to go into a blind trust so that people could have confidence that as commerce secretary, we wanted her expertise, but we didn't want her making decisions that would make her even richer once she left. And so I think that if I were to talk to people around the world, national security positions definitely need to be vetted. But I think sort of finding that intersection between expertise and influence, and then also like post-position profit, I think is really important for people to dig into a little bit more in governments around the world.
How difficult is it for governments to get access to personal information of politicians? And what is your experience in how forthcoming politicians are to giving information that could be sensitive?
Most people, it depends on what kind of sensitive we're talking about. The hardest part of vetting is that so much of it is personal disclosure.
Right.
I have to be forthcoming and tell them the truth in order for them to do their jobs. And so I think that is really hard. I think that if people have a vetting issue that may relate to a personal family member, you can understand those are the issues where you try to use as much discretion as possible and understand where, if someone, for example, has an ill family member or someone who has struggled in the past, I think that you want to handle that with the utmost sensitivity because, that does it really matter? You don't know. If it does, you just want to understand how does it impact that person and their fitness for the job. Chances are it may not. But I think that anything as it relates to personal family is the hardest to disclose and the thing you have to be the most sensitive about when asking, and then protect that information as much as possible. Like, I think the thing that you'll notice here in the US is that vetting reports seldom leak. And I think that that's a really important part of the process.
For sure.
Is that you have to, in as much as you need the person being vetted to entrust you with their most personal financial information, bank records going back to the beginning of time, they need to be able to trust that that's not going to end up in the New York Times.
Yeah.
And I think that, the only real instance I know of a person whose vetting became sort of public fodder was Jared Kushner. And that is because in the US government, we file a form. It's the beginning of your vetting process. It's called the SF-86. It is so many pages. It is so painful to go through. They ask you everything you could possibly imagine. And it was our understanding that you file it once, goes to the FBI, in some cases the CIA, and then you have your interview with the FBI agents. But the reason it became so known is that in the government, you get a badge. Badge has a stripe on it, which indicates your level of clearance. And if the badge is dotted, it means it is interim. And some reporter noticed that Jared Kushner had an interim badge for a very long time. And it turned out that he had to resubmit his SF-86 something like 30 times. Because they kept asking him, I think for Kushner specifically, it had to do with foreign interactions. So when you're going to the federal government, if you have family members who are foreign nationals, you need to put their contact information down. You need to disclose how often you see them, how often you have visited them, and also every single country you have ever visited in your life for the duration and period of time that you were there. And, which, by the way, you start being like, I don't know, does it count when I went to France with my family when I was 12? It does. And for Kushner, there were so many stock issues and foreign entanglement issues that he had just been forgetting, which I assume may possibly be true, but it's the only time I remember hearing anyone's SF-86 ever discussed on the nightly news.
Wow. Direct question regarding the profile of politicians who in the past have been more susceptible to perhaps being nervous about vetting. Older white men, okay? Because they've been in power longer, they've had more relationships, they've had more influences around them. Is an increase of women in power positions also a way to fight against corruption and
I did,
behavior
yes.
that should, that should not happen in those circles?
I do think that, for example, if you are a woman who is at the top of your game in the government and public service, chances are you have worked harder, you have presented yourself in a way, there's a very, it's something that strikes me when you ask the question. There is a television show here in America, some of you may have seen it, called Veep. And it is a parody, a comedy about Selena Meyer, Julia Louis-Dreyfus playing the vice president. And at one point, she ascends to be the president. And someone gets in a fight with her and they say, see, we're never going to have a woman president again because we tried one and she sucked. And I think that's how all of us feel when we get to a certain level, is that we're sort of carrying other women on our backs to say, look, we've made it, we're paving the way for you, and we're going to be as ethical, as moral, as kind as we can possibly be, because there still aren't that many of us that it's commonplace. And so in your heart, you always think that you are being an example, right? Like if I do a great job, they're going to let more women have my job. And which is actually true, is that after I was White House deputy chief, I think most of the people who have followed me have been women. Whereas before, I don't know that there were any women who had been deputy chief for operations. And so I think that we just know that if we can hold ourselves to this standard, then why can't everybody be held to this standard? So I do think that more women in higher power, in higher levels of government, does increase transparency and ethics.
We're wrapping up the conversation, and before we get into the quick fire, I wanted to see whether you had any specific examples of best practice in Europe as well, or areas of Europe that tend to outperform others when it comes to governance matters and transparency matters and vetting processes.
It's really hard to know because everyone in Europe keeps this all very close to the chest. There do seem to be pretty strong examples in Scandinavia of some form of vetting, at least to the cabinet. But one of the interesting articles that I had read was actually in Kenya, where they were talking about vetting their foreign minister. And again, she was a foreign minister, but she was going to be the first woman. And it was just a really interesting, there were all these articles in local papers in Africa about it. And I'm like, you know what, if it can catch on and people are talking about it and they'll see the quality of person that you get when you vet, that is the thing. The more that you vet, and again, in Europe, it seems quite prevalent that foreign ministers, defense ministers are all pretty thoroughly vetted, at least through the national security apparatus. But the more that people realize that a little bit of vetting can go a long way to having just outstanding candidates that can endure the test of time, right? You want someone who is so unimpeachable that they can be there for 2 terms and that they can get the job done, that they have the time to get the job done, and not just this series of people who are appointed and then something embarrassing comes out and they have to leave and then the post is vacant. And I think it really leads to a continuity and greater success.
Final question before the last section. If you're advising an up-and-coming politician, regardless of where that may be, what's the best advice you can give her or him on conducting himself or herself in order to get to president, CEO, prime minister, whatever that may be?
I would say that the people are utterly forgiving if they believe you have told the truth. And so I think that being very frank about, I think that people's instinct is to close in, is to try to hide something that may be a weakness. And I would say expose it before somebody else does. That's my number one. It's like, if you get it out there, people aren't going to be interested in it. And if it's something that should be disclosed, give people a period of time to suss it out, right? To put you through the paces. Because the thing that I think is the worst is, I mean, look at George Santos. He's now a congressman and nobody knows what to do with him. He has no power. He's not representing his district. You know, he's been shunned by everybody. And so I think really giving people, the voters, time to put people through the paces is nothing but upside. And I would just tell anyone running who wants to be in office, we used to call in the White House open kimono. Just open it up, show everyone what you've got, and let them decide.
I think the did you know is a lot sexier than now you know. You know, so from a narrative perspective, definitely clear. All right, quick fire. First one. This is one sentence or one word, okay?
Okay.
A character trait a good leader could really benefit from having.
Honesty.
All right. The biggest challenge of our generation.
Climate change.
It's a popular one. If you could change one thing by magic on the planet, just one, what would you select?
No one should ever be hungry.
Okay, very clear as well. And lastly, what's the most important learning of your career? So if you wrap up right now, you're done, you're not going to work anymore. What are you taking with you? What are you teaching the young ones?
The young ones, lead with kindness, and especially lead with curiosity when you encounter someone who holds a different opinion than you do. It's so easy to be confrontational, to want to just be dug in and steadfast about your opinion. But sometimes when you lead with curiosity and try to understand why someone holds the position that they do, you can actually find common ground, which I think is much needed in this country and across the world.
Okay, that's fantastic. Alyssa, it's been an absolute pleasure to have an opportunity to get your insight, your expertise on vetting. I think everybody watching now has a much better idea of what it is, how it works, and how a country like Portugal can also benefit from having more stringent processes in that area, and continued success in all your work and all your activities as well.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, an absolute pleasure to speak with Alyssa today, Mastromonaco, on vetting, on the process of ensuring that our politicians are fit for office, wherever they may be. See you soon on another episode of It's Not That Simple from the Fundação Francisco Manuel dos Santos.